Divers uncover a shipwreck before noticing a clue about the original owner. But before we start, please make sure to subscribe to m&rtv and hit the bell so you never miss any upload from us. Also, leave a like right now. Scuba divers set out on their aquatic adventures to explore the uniquely gorgeous sights the ocean offers. While most of the time it's fascinating sea creatures and a terrain of vibrant coral reef they see, every once in a while something as epic as a shipwreck suddenly appears, resting peacefully on the ocean floor. One of the biggest questions once a vessel is found is who it belonged to at the time of its demise. That's why scientists and marine biologists were so excited that potential answers regarding ownership of a mystery wreck off the coast of Israel finally revealed themselves. The coast of Israel in the Tantura Lagoon near Dor Beach was buzzing with excitement. The seemingly tranquil waters had a team from the University of Haifa itching to take a closer look. Nautical archaeologists at the university's m&rtv Institute for Maritime Studies couldn't believe the wreck, which was discovered first in 1976, was seriously studied by anyone. The area is a hotspot for scuba divers all over. When the initial diver discovered the wreck, he immediately told local authorities about the find. Unfortunately, the amateur explorer faced a huge problem when it came to the excavation, as most ordinary people would. He didn't have the experience or the financial means for a rigorous study. Of course, the country of Israel did, but for whatever reason, no one took any action until 2008. That was the year Deborah Zwickel, an author and nautical archaeologist who worked at the m&rtv Institute for Maritime Studies, took charge to finally get the boat out of the lagoon. Zwickel assembled a team of equally enthusiastic researchers and scientists to figure out, once and for all, exactly whom the mystery boat belonged to, but it wasn't going to be easy. Usually, when a ship is found, there's some kind of indication, whether it's a marking on the ship's side or particular artifacts of the vessel's owner. This, however, had nothing of the sort. What the diving team did find, however, was a very well-preserved double-masted vessel. From the look of it, the ship wasn't too ancient, but then again, there really was no knowing until analysis was complete. There were also plenty of artifacts on board, and many of them, much like the ship, were in pristine condition. The team recovered several ceramic bowls, glassware, eroded utensils, and even expired provisions. It was an amazing find that Zwickel couldn't believe sat at the bottom of the lagoon for so long. Now that it finally had the attention it deserved, the team started bringing piece by piece into their lab. The massive chunks of wood and metal were lifted out of the water by huge excavators, loaded into trucks, and then carefully placed on the lab's tables for cleaning. It was an immense undertaking. The crew meticulously washed all of the sand and sediment off of each chunk. After a thorough cleaning and careful look at the artifacts, the scientists realized the inventory might just hold the key to the ship's origins. There were several markings and letters printed on many of the broken pieces. The small splintered shards were of no use, but the bigger ones led to the first actual breakthrough of the investigation. Some of the intact ceramic bowls had a very specific lion motif, and the team connected the vessel to a company named Guichard Frères, which operated from 1889 to 1897. But Zwickel wanted to know more. Evidence of whom the ship belonged to was still very much lacking, so Zwickel teamed up with a graduate student named Mickey Holzman to comb through old documents from the wreck's era. Then it hit them like a brick. Member of the famous Rothschild banking dynasty, Baron de Rothschild, actually had ties to an area of land right next to the lagoon. It was a Jewish settlement called Zikron Yaakov that he founded in the late 1800s. The settlement is thriving today, but when it first began, tons of goods were needed. So Rothschild purchased 3 ships to transport materials to and from the area. According to documents, only 2 of the ships were accounted for. Based on this evidence, Zwickel and the team had a strong inkling the ship in the lagoon was Rothschild's third undocumented craft. More tests will occur, of course, but at least they know the boat originated on Earth. Some researchers can't even make that assumption. The Swedish Ocean X diving team, led by Peter Lindberg and Dennis Alsberg, didn't expect to find much while treasure hunting 300 feet from the surface of the northern Baltic Sea. After all, the water is freezing, dark, and difficult to navigate. They were trying to find the remnants of an old shipwreck, so they were keeping an eye out for anything oddly shaped and weirdly colored. It was a slow, quiet work on the sea floor until the eerie silence was punctuated by a beep. The beeping came from their sonar equipment, which seconds before had shown only murky blackness. Now, however, its screen was covered with a mysterious sight, a tall, mountainous structure surrounded by rock. This turned out to be a canyon made out of stones, sand, and molten rock. But what really caught their eye wasn't at the bottom of the deep, dark cavern. Instead, it was just a couple feet nearby. "We were really surprised and puzzled," Dennis said of the new discovery. "We were thinking this is not a wreck." It was easy to verify Dennis's theory that their new discovery wasn't a shipwreck, but its true identity was more difficult to figure out. If you're an explorer worth your salt, you don't immediately jump to extraterrestrial conclusions as soon as you see something unusual. Peter and Dennis then were quick to bounce around some logical explanations for the object. First, they thought it was some kind of submarine left over from World War II, or perhaps an old battleship gun turret. But each time they referred back to the blurry sonar image, they couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else entirely. The object was a circle about 200 feet in diameter, with odd rivets and cracks across the top. The image they captured was so grainy, however, that it was difficult to see much else, so they returned a year later, but this time with backup. "It could be something really awesome that we found," Dennis said, and he hoped that backup in the form of more advanced equipment would answer the biggest question about the object: what the heck it even was. But they immediately encountered an issue. The problem wasn't the clarity of the image, but the equipment itself. It just wouldn't take a photo. According to the explorers, every time the cameras got close to the object, they would cut out completely. Stefan Hogerborn, a professional diver with Ocean X, was baffled by the malfunctions. "Anything electric out there stopped working when we were above the object," he claimed. Though the team was at a loss, one group of people quickly came to the rescue. See, the sonar photo of the structure had leaked online despite Peter and Dennis's claim that they wished to keep it totally quiet. It wasn't long before the internet took in the object's rivets and cracks and arrived at a sound conclusion. "Yeah, definitely the Millennium Falcon," one person commented on a news story about the discovery. "It's true that the object's appearance looks strikingly like Han Solo's beloved spaceship, but could it really be an object from outer space?" What really piqued the interest of the explorers wasn't the size or shape of the object, but what it appeared to be made of: metal. After all, why would a 200-foot object made of metal be chilling on the ocean floor? The theory that the object was actually metal and not a rock formation only intensified the spaceship rumors. So in order to ease the public and their own nagging curiosity, Peter and Dennis opened the mystery up to experts, and the experts had thoughts. Scientist Charles Paul said the original grainy image was sediment dropped from a fishing trawler, a school of fish, or even something as simple as a pile of rocks. The spaceship theory, he claimed, is curious and fun, but much ado about nothing. Another scientist, Goran Ekberg, agreed that the finding looks weird since it's completely circular, but nature has produced stranger things than that. The most incinerating claim, however, came from an actual expert on extraterrestrial life. Doubtful of Peter and Dennis's motives, Jonathan Hill of Mars Spaceflight Facility said, "Whenever people make extraordinary claims, it's always a good idea to consider whether they are personally benefiting from the claim." Still, Peter and Dennis had at least a little support. Geologist Steve Weiner, claimed that, according to his own tests, the structure was not a geological formation. He was even quoted supporting one of the most outlandish claims. The object, Steve claimed, was made out of metals which nature could not reproduce itself. Peter hoped this kind of support from Steve would solve the mystery of the sunken ship and help his team go further than ever before with their research. In 2019, Peter suggested that Ocean X may return to the object with an entire camera crew in tow. With a TV series, Peter hoped more light would be shed on the object's identity. As for now, they are at least sure about one thing. There is something we don't usually find in nature sitting in the depths of the Baltic Sea, Peter concluded. Whether or not this is true is still anyone's guess, but as any good explorer knows, the mystery is the best part of the expedition. If they want to preserve their find, they'll need to work quickly. The Baltic Sea is a hotspot for explorers. Swedish archaeologist Jim Hansen from the Stockholm Maritime Museum, for instance, received an unexpected phone call. It came from workers who found something rare in its waters. A construction crew had to halt the renovation of a quarry in Stockholm when they came across a big surprise in the dirt. Like the Ocean X team, none of them could at first identify the mystery object, but it looked to be made of wood. Very old wood. Doubling Jim's interest was the location of the quarry. It was on Skeppsholmen Island, smack dab between Center City Stockholm and the Baltic Sea. If you were to visit the island today, you would mostly come across charming tourist attractions, but that hasn't always been the case. Historically, Skeppsholm served as a prime military location for Sweden. It acted as a waypoint where officials could send out troops and supplies, as well as a line of defense against any powers attempting to invade Stockholm. In other words, it was rich with military history. Jim and some of his colleagues ran over to inspect the construction site. As they surveyed the wooden beams lying deep beneath the ground, Jim was immensely grateful the workers hadn't interfered anymore with the object. He had a feeling this was something big. In fact, Jim theorized this Skeppsholm dig might connect to one of his recent findings. A few months earlier, he mounted an extensive underwater expedition in southern Sweden. This was no recreational dive. On the dive, he and his team were the first humans in hundreds of years to set their eyes on the Blekinge. The Swedes built this mighty ship in the late 1600s while at war with Russia and Denmark. So what did this have to do with Stockholm? As Jim unearthed more of the wooden artifact, he confirmed his suspicions. They were looking at a ship, perhaps one of the most important vessels in the history of Sweden. However, Jim knew he couldn't get ahead of himself. To determine the exact identity of the mystery vessel, Jim and other scientists got down and dirty in the pit. Specific details within the ruins would tell them everything they needed to know. Jim turned his attention to some of the best preserved timbers. You can actually see the axe marks where the shipwrights cut and fit together the wooden beams. That wasn't all that caught Jim's eye either. By taking just a small sample of wood, small enough to not damage the overall vessel, they could figure out what time period the ship was from. Jim shipped the fragment off to the lab for radiocarbon dating. Jim's team came back with good news. The oak timbers were from 1612 or 1613, meaning the ship's construction wrapped up a couple years after. Fortunately, the Maritime Museum had detailed records of all the major vessels built in Sweden. Using the records and some other clues, including this ornamental copper plate, Jim surmised they'd found the famous scepter. It seemed almost too good to be true. After all, it was the flagship of the greatest Swedish monarch of all time. The tactical brilliance of King Gustavus Adolphus the Great transformed Sweden into a major European power back in the 17th century. He commissioned the scepter to lead a fleet to conquer nearby Latvia. The ship never made it. As it approached the Baltic coast, the scepter suffered heavy damage from a storm. It turned back to Sweden and never sailed on a major voyage again. But how did it end up beneath a historic island in Stockholm? Historians could not find any record of a shipwreck in Skeppsholmen. However, Jim had a wild suggestion. Maybe Gustavus sunk it on purpose. It was, after all, a regular practice for the Swedish Navy to sink retired vessels to provide a foundation for new shipyards. Now that Jim and his team unearthed the top deck of the famed warship, they had to decide what to do next. A couple individuals raised the possibility of restoring the scepter. After all, there was precedent for such a course of action. Historians salvaged another sunken 17th century ship, the Vasa, in 1961, and put it on display at the museum. The impressive restoration soon became one of the most noteworthy cultural sites in all of Sweden. Could the scepter follow in its footsteps? Unfortunately, Jim knew it was not to be. While the scepter had multiple decks in its prime, none of them remained in good enough condition to warrant the restoration. The project would simply cost too much for too little reward. Nevertheless, Jim and his colleagues chalked up their discovery as a major victory. He explained, "It's a really important find because the ship is from the generation before Vasa, so we can see the technical building methods that were used, and it can help us understand what went wrong with the Vasa as well." In other words, the knowledge attached to an artifact is always more important than the object itself. Plus, it will certainly lead to even bigger finds in the near future. Who can say what other secrets Jim Hansen will uncover in his hometown?